All right, well, thank you very much, John. I really appreciate the introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. I appreciate not only the introduction in terms of my background, but also your comments on the state of the world today. I completely share your perspective. I'm very appreciative and grateful to George Mason University, the National Security Institute, for inviting me here today. I was prepared to say that I was sad that Jamil Jaffer, the head of the National Security Institute, wasn't going to be here, but I am very pleased to say that he is here with us today. For many of you who may not know, Jamil was in an accident recently, a scooter accident, and in Los Angeles, and so for those of Jamil, your friends, and those who love you, we're really pleased to see that you're doing so well. So thanks again. You look great. I've known Jamil for a long time, more than 15 years. We were together in the National Security Division when it was first started in 2006. And I have to tell you, I am so impressed with what Jamil, you and the rest of the NSI team have built here. In just a few years, you have gained a well-deserved reputation for taking on hard problems and tackling those problems and developing practical solutions. And this is something that's well known now, I think, in the broader national security community that you've done here at NSI. And I believe, knowing Jamil, that what you have here at NSI really reflects Jamil's determination and doggedness, as well as his commitment to our country's national security. So let me talk a little bit about, first of all, the National Security Division, where I am privileged to be now. It was started, as I said, more than 15 years ago, 2006. I was the senior career official responsible for the Department of Justice's intelligence work, really think FISA. This past November, I then returned to the National Security Division as the Assistant Attorney General for National Security, and it's remarkable for me to be back after that much time has passed and to see how NSD has grown over the years and all that it has achieved. And I am incredibly proud to be leading NSD and its very dedicated and committed workforce today. As many of you know, Congress created NSD in the wake of the September 11th attacks. The idea was to unify the different parts of the Department of Justice that focused on national security and to prioritize that work, and then to promote cooperation more broadly between the Department of Justice and the intelligence community. In the years since its founding, again and again, the work of the NSD team has proven critical to our national security. In everything we do at the Department of Justice, and I'm going to come back to this theme, our first priority is to adhere to the Constitution and to pursue equal justice under the law. And this mandate is really the North Star of our work. The division has a wide range of responsibilities. These include going after terrorists and spies. That includes in cyberspace. We counter foreign malign influence. We enforce our export controls and sanctions laws. We review foreign investment in United States companies. We also handle intelligence work and oversight. That includes FISA, as I mentioned, but it also includes providing advice on national security law and policies. And within each of these areas, NSD is at the forefront of efforts to use our legal authorities and tools to tackle evolving national security threats. When I was first at NSD, looking back with some reflection today, it's interesting, to think back that terrorism was our number one focus. And that stayed true, at least for me, through my time, as John mentioned, when I was at NSA and then as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center from 2011 to 2014. But today, as I now have seen firsthand during my first few months on the job, the overall threat landscape is much more complex. International terrorism, no doubt, remains a significant concern, but we also face an elevated threat from domestic terrorism, who are motivated by a mix of ideologies. In cyberspace, we confront everything from profit-driven efforts to steal trade secrets and military technology to state-sponsored efforts in cyber targeting our critical infrastructure. Hostile foreign governments assault our democratic and economic institutions in pursuit of strategic competitive advantage. This is a threat that is different today than it was when I was in the government 5, 6, 7 years ago. These threats are dynamic. We and our partners at the FBI and the intelligence community have to be both determined and agile to meet them. So today, I want to take a few minutes to specifically focus on the threats we face from hostile nations. We are launching a new strategy in the National Security Division called the Strategy for Countering Nation-State Threats. Our goal with this strategy is to take a comprehensive approach. It's going to draw on the full power of our tools and authorities to address the alarming rise in illegal activity from hostile nations. And this includes growing threats within the United States to Americans, as well as threats to Americans and U.S. interests abroad. We see nations such as China, Russia, Iran, North Korea becoming more aggressive and more capable in their nefarious activity than ever before. These nations seek to undermine our core democratic, economic, and scientific institutions, and they employ a growing range of tactics to advance their interests and to harm the United States. Defending American institutions and values against these threats is a national security priority, and it's a priority for the Department of Justice. So this new strategy is threat-driven. We are going to prioritize NSD's work and the use of our tools, and we're going to allocate our resources to address these threats head-on while at the same time preserving the flexibility that we need to counter these threats effectively. And we're deploying this strategy to focus on those areas where I believe the Department of Justice can have the most impact in combating the greatest threats to our national security. So let me give you some examples of what I'm talking about in terms of these threats, starting with transnational repression. In recent years, we have seen a rise in efforts by authoritarian regimes to interfere with freedom of expression and punish dissidents abroad. And these acts of repression cross national borders, often reaching into the United States. We have pursued, for example, agents of the Chinese government who have tried to coerce American citizens and residents to comply with China's repressive and extralegal orders. For example, we charged PRC government officials for taking part in what's called Operation Fox Hunt, an illegal, multi-year campaign to coerce the return of Chinese nationals to China. And what we've alleged in the indictment represents a direct affront to the rule of law, human rights, and American sovereignty. Instead of cooperating with the approval and coordination of our government, PRC officials traveled to the United States, directed PRC operatives to violate U.S. law. This scheme included, for example, threatening one victim's daughter over social media, even bringing his elderly father from China to the United States to warn that the victim's family in China could be harmed if the victim did not return. We've charged 9 people in relation to Operation Fox Hunt, including for acting as illegal agents of the PRC government and for interstate and international stalking. Then just last month, we charged 4 senior officials of the government of Belarus. We alleged that they conspired to use a false bomb threat to force a plane to divert and to land. The plane was carrying 4 American citizens, and the purpose of the forced landing of the plane was to arrest a prominent Belarusian dissident. And last summer, we charged 4 Iranian intelligence agents for conspiring to kidnap a US-based journalist and human rights activist who was speaking out against Iran's repressive laws and practices. So this sort of oppressive behavior is antithetical to our values as Americans. People from all over the world are drawn to the United States to the promise of living in a free and open society, one that adheres to the rule of law. And to ensure that this promise remains a reality, we have to continue to use all of our tools to block authoritarian regimes from engaging in this type of activity. They seek to extend their tactics of repression beyond their borders into the United States. So that's one example. Another, foreign malign influence. We have to defend the integrity of American political discourse by exposing foreign malign influence campaigns. Our laws demand that foreign governments and agents be transparent about their efforts to influence the American public and insist that they represent those parts of our electoral processes that are reserved to Americans alone. I should say, insist that they respect those parts of our electoral processes that are reserved to Americans alone. In recent years, DOJ has exposed and prosecuted covert influence efforts undertaken on behalf of the governments of Russia, China, Malaysia, Pakistan, to name a few. And at the same time, we're strengthening the civil and administrative provisions of the Foreign Agents Registration Act. The failure of hostile nation states to respect national boundaries and basic legal norms is even more stark in the cyber realm. We continue to see costly interference with critical infrastructure and public service systems, supply chains, and private businesses. And we also confront campaigns of theft of sensitive information, ransomware attacks, and digital extortion. So some examples. Last year, the PRC government engaged in a malicious cyber campaign using vulnerabilities in the Microsoft Exchange server. I know this is familiar to many of you. This campaign targeted thousands of victims around the world. Russia's solar wind attack similarly compromised tens of thousands of networks globally, including those of US, state, federal, local governments. Iranian government actors have interfered with systems of a broad range of victims in critical infrastructure sectors. And then North Korean government actors have robbed cryptocurrency exchanges and central banks alike, stealing hundreds of millions of dollars and evading international sanctions designed to limit their weapons systems, limit their weapons programs. Our role at DOJ is to seek to identify and disrupt cyber threats to national security and hold these malicious actors accountable. Finally, of course, we remain vigilant against core national security threats like traditional espionage activities and efforts to evade export control and sanction laws. It's essential that we thwart attempts to unlawfully obtain classified information relating to our national defense, weapons systems, and sensitive technologies and research. We have to continue to hold rogue actors accountable for malign activities and work with like-minded partners around the world to deter and impose consequences on those who flout the rule of law. So, as you can see from these examples, we at the Justice Department confront threats from a variety of nation-state actors. Our new strategy reflects this reality. There is no one threat that is unique to a single adversary. But at the same time, it's also clear to me that the government of China stands apart. So I want to address how the department's approach to Chinese government activity fits within our overall more broad strategy. As the FBI director publicly noted a few weeks ago, the threats from the PRC government are more brazen and more damaging than ever before. He is absolutely right. The PRC government threatens our security through its concerted use of espionage, theft of trade secrets, malicious cyber activity, transnational repression, and other tactics to advance its interests against ours. To be clear, when I talk about this threat, we are focused on the actions of the PRC government, the Chinese Communist Party, and their agents, not the Chinese people or those of Chinese descent. And as we talk about the threats that the PRC government poses to the United States, it is critical that we never lose sight of that fundamental distinction. We must always be vigilant to ensure that no one is treated differently based on race, ethnicity, familial ties, or national origin, and this is a foundational commitment of the Department of Justice. Let me give you a few examples with that distinction in mind of what the PRC government is doing. First, it has targeted U.S. citizens with connections to the intelligence community in order to obtain valuable government and military secrets. In recent years, we have prosecuted 4 espionage cases involving the PRC that reflect a concerted effort to steal our most sensitive information. Next, the government of China has also used espionage tools and tactics against U.S. companies and American workers to steal critical and emerging technologies. Again, agents of the PRC government have been caught stealing everything from cutting-edge semiconductor technology to actual seeds that have been deployed for pharmaceutical uses after years of research in this country and the investment of millions of dollars. Third, the PRC government has used malicious and unlawful cyber campaigns to pursue technological advancement and profit. The PRC government reaps the benefits of these criminal activities, while the victims, including governments, businesses, and critical infrastructure operators, lose billions of dollars in intellectual property, proprietary information, ransom payments, and mitigation efforts. And then finally, as I've mentioned, the government of China has gone to great lengths to silence dissent. It has intimidated journalists, employed a variety of means to attempt to censor and punish U.S. citizens, residents, and companies for exercising their rights to free expression. I mentioned earlier Operation Foxhunt, which is just one example. So, it's against this backdrop that the department announced the China Initiative in 2018. And the idea behind the China Initiative was to develop a coherent approach to the challenges posed by the PRC. And the initiative effectively focused attention on the multifaceted threat from the government of China. But this initiative has also engendered growing concerns that we have to take seriously. So I want to take the opportunity today to discuss our approach to nation-state threats overall and to also address the China Initiative directly. We have heard concerns from the civil rights community that the China Initiative has fueled a narrative of intolerance and bias. To many, that narrative suggests that the Justice Department treats people from China or of Chinese descent differently. The rise in anti-Asian hate crime and hate incidents only serves to heighten these concerns. And the department is keenly aware of this threat and is enhancing its efforts to combat acts of hate. These efforts are reflected in the Attorney General's memorandum last year following the enactment of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act. There are also increasing concerns from the academic and scientific community about the department's pursuit of certain research grant fraud cases, and I'm going to talk about those specifically. We have heard that those prosecutions and the public narrative around those cases can lead to a chilling atmosphere for scientists and scholars that damages the scientific enterprise in the United States. Safeguarding the integrity and transparency of research institutions is a matter of national security, but so is ensuring that we continue to attract the very best and the very brightest researchers and scholars to our country from around the world, and that we continue to honor the tradition in this country of academic openness and collaboration. So in light of all of these concerns, when I began a review back in November when I first took office, it was to hear from folks about these concerns. The purpose of this review that we started in November of last year was forward-looking. The key question was whether this framework was still the best way to address the strategic needs and priorities of the Justice Department. And while I remain focused on the evolving significant threat that China poses, I have concluded that this initiative is not the right approach, and instead, the current threat landscape demands a broader approach. So I want to emphasize my belief that the department's actions over the past few years have been driven by genuine national security concerns, but by grouping cases under the China Initiative rubric, we helped give rise to a harmful perception that the Department of Justice applies a lower standard to its investigation and prosecution of criminal conduct related to that country, or that we in some way view people with racial, ethnic, or familial ties to China differently. I began my career at the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division. I know that the department is committed to protecting the civil rights of everyone in our country. But this erosion of trust in the department can impair our national security. It alienates us from the people we serve, including the very communities the PRC often targets as victims. Our reputation around the world for being a country dedicated to civil rights and to the rule of law is one of our greatest strengths. So as part of this review, I have paid particular attention, as I mentioned, to cases involving academic integrity and research security. When it comes to these cases going forward, the National Security Division will take an active supervisory role in these investigations and prosecutions. In evaluating these cases, NSD will work with the FBI and other investigative agencies to assess the evidence of intent and materiality present in those cases, as well as any nexus to national or economic security. These considerations will guide our decisions, including whether criminal prosecution is warranted or whether civil or administrative remedies are more appropriate. In addition, recently the White House Office of Science and Technology released new guidance to federal funding agencies that include procedures to correct inaccurate or incomplete prior disclosures about connections. These agencies have primary responsibility for research integrity and security, where individuals voluntarily correct prior material omissions and resolve related administrative inquiries. This will counsel against a criminal prosecution in accordance with long-standing Department of Justice principles of prosecutorial discretion. So, make no mistake, we will be relentless in defending our country from China. The department will continue to prioritize and aggressively counter the actions of the PRC government that harm our people and our institutions. But our review convinced us that a new approach is needed to tackle the most severe threats from a range of hostile nation-state actors. So, going forward, the National Security Division will pursue this work guided by our strategy for countering nation-state threats. Our recent experience confronting the very threats posed by the Chinese government has shown that a multifaceted challenge demands an integrated and multifaceted response. We need to expand our approach to these threats by recognizing that the capabilities of each hostile nation and the full spectrum of activity each country undertakes to achieve its goals. And we must align our capabilities, our tools, and our resources with those across the federal government to meet and counter these threats. So our work will be guided by three strategic imperatives. First, We must continue to defend core national security interests and protect our most sensitive information and resources. We are going to continue to aggressively investigate and prosecute espionage, export control, and sanctions violations, and any interference with our critical infrastructure. Second, we're going to protect our economic security and prosperity, including key technologies, private information about Americans, supply chains, and industry. We will bring all of our tools to bear on this challenge, including the regulatory authorities that we have as part of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States and Team Telecom, as well as criminal process when appropriate, to prevent and mitigate harms from economic espionage, hostile manipulation, and cyber-related malicious activity. And then third, we must continue to defend our democratic institutions and values to ensure that the promise of freedom in the United States remains a reality in the face, and it's poignant to say this today, in the face of rising authoritarianism. We remain steadfast in our commitment to preventing malign influence inside our borders and to promoting freedom of expression and democracy against corrupt and repressive regimes. As we move forward, the Department remains committed to confronting any nation that threatens U.S. national security, economic security, or our democratic institutions and freedoms. So we will use all of these legal tools in our arsenal to combat these threats. The cornerstone of our work at the Justice Department is to investigate and prosecute crimes sponsored by hostile governments and their agents. This includes prosecuting state agents for espionage, hacking campaigns against our government or the private sector, and the repression of critics, as well as efforts to manipulate the public discourse within the United States. But in addition to our criminal enforcement work, we will also use our civil and administrative tools to mitigate threats from foreign investment activity and foreign interests that seek to secretly influence public opinion in the United States. We will also support broader whole-of-government efforts, which include, of course, diplomatic engagement, the use of economic tools, resilience building in communities within the United States and abroad to address these threats. And we will reach out, along with our partners in the federal government, to build trust with affected communities, to understand their public safety needs, and to ensure they feel comfortable reporting crimes. Finally, we will continue to engage with democratic allies to share information and to discuss how together we can make our partner countries more secure. Again, together we will develop strategies for effectively responding to these grave threats to the rule of law and to our economic integrity. So in conclusion, the United States is a beacon for people all over the world who seek to live in an open and democratic society. And it's our duty to protect the United States from the myriad threats we face while staying true to the Constitution and to the values of the Justice Department. I know that this commitment to securing equal justice while defending our national security is one that's shared by everyone in the National Security Division and across the Department of Justice. So with that, again, my thanks to John and Jamil and to NSI and to you all for being here and listening to me this afternoon, and I'd be happy to take some questions. Thanks. All right, John, questions?
So, folks, just a reminder for the audience to please get your question cards and questions from online to the NSI team, and we will get to those shortly after a short chat that I'm going to lead here with Matt. So let's start with the China Initiative. We're here hosted at an academic institution, a university, George Mason University. At NSI, Jamil and we make it a point not to be overly concerned or overly impressed with what we call sort of boxology solutions, where boxes on the org chart are moved around and things appear to be prioritized or not. I appreciate your remarks. We want to do both, right? We want to ensure that we have integrity in our federal funding programs and at our research institutions. We also want to maintain sort of the benefits of having open, these open cultures that become a pull of gravity to the United States for the best and brightest around the world. So, but let's talk about the threat from the CCP. You outlined an array of activity. It's multifaceted. The director of the FBI, just recently again reiterated that, and I'll quote him, there's just no country that presents a broader threat to our ideas, our innovation, and our economic security than China. He's opening 2 counterintelligence cases a day. Estimates range to upwards of $600 billion in theft of intellectual property from the United States. The list goes on. As you did your review of the China initiative, understanding that one of the outcomes is to tailor criminal prosecutions to a degree, what did you learn about the scale and nature of the threat that's unique and particular and most challenging with China?
Yeah, I think that's certainly, as I started this review, the first place I went was to the FBI to talk to our partners there, and particularly in the counterintelligence division, but across the FBI and to the intelligence community to try to understand better the threat that we face. And that's one of the lessons I learned from being at the National Counterterrorism Center for 3 years as the director, is that everything we do has to be driven by the threat. And that's the starting point for any strategy, any approach. I have been struck, as I said in my remarks, by the level of threat we face from a range of nation states, but that certainly does include China. And I know that exactly that I read the FBI director's speech where he talks about that China, no government poses a broader, more severe threat to our ideas, innovation, and economic security. And I totally agree with his assessment of the threat from China. And one of the aspects of the threat from the Chinese government, from the PRC government, is that it's a concerted one. There's sort of a multifaceted aspect to it where it combines in I think probably a long-term strategy to look at ways to outcompete us technologically, militarily, and economically. And they pose a threat to us across a number of vectors: economic espionage, theft of trade secrets, malicious cyber activity. So I think I have, as I've worked through this strategy, there's no doubt that China poses a significant threat in the way the director of the FBI describes, and that's why I am so committed to being relentless to protect our country from that threat.
So how do you, losing the moniker, how do you continue to demonstrate that this threat, which the most significant threat remains the most significant priority within NSD, within broader DOJ, the signal you're sending to the FBI and law enforcement, the signal you're sending to universities, research institutions, and the like, in terms of the continued diligence and the continued priority that needs to be applied to to the scale and threat posed by the CCP.
I think that it's important when we talk about the threat, and this is why I again harken back to my time at the National Counterterrorism Center. There's no doubt that China is a significant threat actor, particularly in the realm of countering our economic prosperity. But I don't think that it's wise or is good strategy to focus on one country, particularly when we're talking about the level of nation-state activity that I've seen, again, from Iran, North Korea, and of course, as we sit here today, Russia. And so the question I've asked as our team and as I've conducted this review is, how do we make sure that we are aligning our priorities? And I'm sending, as you said, John, the signal to the National Security Division, to the U.S. Attorney's offices, to investigators at the FBI, to the intelligence community, about what we are prioritizing and how we're working with them to make sure that we're looking at all the tools that we have, certainly criminal prosecution, but other tools to combat that array of threats. And it was, it struck me that they're focusing on the China initiative didn't make sense anymore in the context of the array of threats we face, again, from a broad range of state actors.
Yeah, fair enough. And we're gonna broaden this out a bit. I'm just gonna harass you for one more minute here. So, one of the things that that you just mentioned is perhaps unique, or at least the scale is unique when it comes to China, is the focus on economic security, the attempts to acquire by hook or crook, technology, scientific discovery, what have you. And the China Initiative, one of the things that it did highlight is some of the areas where we have some soft underbelly, if you will, at these research and academic institutions that treasure values of openness, of cooperation, global cooperation, and the pursuit of scientific discovery and the like. We saw from the White House recently guidance about how we might, sort of improve disclosure around conflicts of interest and conflicts of commitment and the like. But we haven't, it seems, yet gotten to the point where we have started to rethink or to at least review whether we should be rethinking. Do we need to put in place new guardrails to any extent on some of the research that we are funding currently in a much more open way? A recent bipartisan report from the Senate after an investigation recommended that we should be reconsidering these things. Is that something that you're thinking about, that the administration is considering? Are there certain guardrails we should consider around talent programs or other matters?
So, the way I think about that question is there's no doubt that what the Chinese government has done is to exploit our openness. One of our greatest strengths is our open democratic system, but it also presents opportunities for a nefarious actor like the PRC to try to exploit that for their own benefit. And certainly sitting here at George Mason University, this university, like every university, like all of the funding agencies, like NASA and the National Science Foundation, that you all are entitled to know when you sponsor research or fund research, that you're doing so in a way that's free of conflicts of interest. And I am not taking that tool off the table. When we find cases where somebody is fraudulently, covertly has a conflict of interest, and we can show that, and we have evidence of intent and materiality, and when we look at any connection to national security or economic security, we're going to continue to bring those cases. I am, though, concerned, and we have had cases that have not turned out well for the Justice Department, and I am aware that some of those cases and some of the work in this area has engendered the perception that we have a different standard, a lower standard for people who are ethnically Chinese or have some connection to China, and that is absolutely unacceptable. And we need to address that because it undermines our efforts, it's wrong, and we need to take steps to address that as well. So what I think we need to do is bring those cases that are strong in this context. Also, though, look for other avenues to address wrongdoing or to establish accountability through civil and administrative penalties. I do think the White House's work will help facilitate some of that because it will help clarify the rules in this area. And in any event, this is not the most significant aspect of the work we're doing to counter Chinese nefarious activity. That's really the focus there for the National Security Division is on economic espionage and theft of trade secrets and the like.
So let's talk about that a bit. In addition to your career in government, you also more recently served in the private sector, helping to found a cybersecurity firm and otherwise. What did you learn about the threat that the private sector is facing on a daily basis from the myriad of nation-state actors? The private sector is having to wage, a defensive campaign against nation-states on a daily basis. Many of them are very much outgunned, outmanned. There continue to be limitations on what the U.S. government does to support them. Talk about what you saw and experienced now that you've been on both sides, and what more can we do rather than maybe taking individual cases and plugging individual leaks, but at a more systemic level to really change the game when it comes to supporting the private sector?
So I think this is such a great question, and I know NSI has done work on this issue, or this set of issues, really, this challenge. And when I think about this, I draw on my own experience, having been the general counsel at NSA, so I got to see firsthand what NSA's capabilities are and some of NSA's intelligence collection. So I know about this question from the perspective of an intelligence agency. I also think about this question from my time at the National Counterterrorism Center, where, if you think about the way in which the United States, our allies, confront terrorism threats, it is a whole of government response. It's a coherent response. It is one where the government feels, completely responsible for responding to terrorists.
Right.
And then you contrast that with what we all can see in terms of the cyber threat. I saw the cyber threat, both having worked in a small company that was building software to protect companies, but also my last job was in a technology company where I oversaw the team that handled, we called it engineering security, but it was cybersecurity and the chief information security officer. And it was a big team. It was a team of 200 people devoted to that in a technology company. So I feel like I've seen this from several different sides. So this is a long warm-up to try to figure out how to answer the hard problem that you posed. But I mean, the difference between terrorism and cyber is so much of the threats we face with respect to malicious cyber activity really fall on the shoulders of the private sector. And the government plays a role that is not, to my view, has not been sufficient to protect the private sector, particularly critical infrastructure. And we haven't really figured out how to do that holistically in the way I think we do when it comes to terrorism. So I think there's a lot of good energy around this, a lot of good ideas. Sharing information obviously is always one way to think about this. Certainly, I think for my role today, as I've sort of stepped out of my lane and answering that question, I think going back into the National Security Division, we have a critical role to play in terms of investigating and prosecuting and calling out malicious cyber actors, and I think that's a big part of it. We also support the FBI in its efforts to reach out to industry as well as Homeland Security, which obviously has a significant role here. I just feel like this kind of holistic government effort with the Justice Department, the intelligence community, the Homeland Security, working together seamlessly, we're getting there, but that's an area that I think we continue to focus.
It seems there are some parallels perhaps between the private sector, as you talked about, being to a degree on its own and defending themselves with what we were talking about before, with universities and research institutions essentially being left responsible to try to conduct due diligence against sophisticated intelligence operations by nation-state adversaries. But let's move to, you talked about the transnational sort of threat that seems to be increasing. This is this sort of expanding global repression is an area that's going to be a focus for NSI this year. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that. What tools? So there are a number of different aspects of this, and some of it fall easily and squarely into potential criminal prosecution. Some of what we think about, and we have a lot of national debate around, in terms of self-censorship among our private sector and our universities, the economic leverage that kind of stifles people's feeling of freedom to speak and to dissent against what the CCP is doing at home and abroad. How do you think about these different aspects of the transnational threat? What are the aspects that are core to what NSD and the Justice Department can go after? What tools do you have to address them? How do you address something like the CCP's willingness to coerce people through essentially taking family members hostage and the like. Help fill in some gaps.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm pleased to hear that NSI is going to be focusing on this challenge of transnational repression. I think it's a significant challenge for our country. Again, our greatest strength is our openness, and our democratic institutions, our universities. But these can also pose, vulnerabilities for us, and not that should change the way, our values. But it's just a reality that China, but also other governments, seek to exploit. And so I think when it comes to the tools that we have in the Justice Department, it's primarily investigation and prosecution, because often these types of repressive activities violate U.S. laws, U.S. criminal laws. We have 4 cases where we have charged the agents of 4 different cases, one involving, the PRC, one involving Egypt, one involving Belarus, one involving Iran, all with this theme of transnational repression, some within our borders, some outside of our borders. So the primary tool and set of authorities we have are criminal prosecution, but I do think part of it is also for us to work with the FBI, which has close relationships with institutions, including universities, to bring attention to this challenge. In some ways, it's a matter of education. Where these challenges are most prominent, I think the university community is a primary one. But then again, sort of work that civil society organizations like NSI do, again, to draw attention to this. Because, again, I've been struck since I have returned to government over the past 4 months how much activity there is in this area. And it's absolutely antithetical to our values of openness and free expression as Americans. And that's why I think it's so important that we focus on it.
So I'm going to try to squeeze in 2 more, and then we'll go to the audience questions. In terms of, within the context of the nation-state threat that you're talking about, I think it's fair to say that one of the more utilized or powerful components or tools that they're bringing to bear is actually the use of non-state actors, right? And sometimes it's, an alignment of objectives. Sometimes it's more coordinated and directed. Sometimes it's, just a convergence of opportunity and the like. How do you think about addressing these non-state actors, criminal organizations, ransomware groups, terrorist groups, et cetera, within the nation-state context and the strategy that you'll be deploying? How do they fit within that? How do we know? What does it mean? Does it mean anything that that this coordination is happening? How do we think about harboring? How do you think through the issue about the use of non-state actors?
I mean, it's a great question. Again, I do think it's a particular challenge in the context of malicious cyber activity, where it's not uncommon for non-state actors to be tolerated or have some relation to the nation state itself. And so I think for us, and given our tools in the Justice Department, again, by investigating and prosecuting these individuals, we can identify and attribute their connection to nation states, and even where it's not apparent, or maybe we're not able to make it apparent, the act of prosecution does shine a light on their nefarious activities. And again, I think we've learned a lot in the counterterrorism realm on how to use our federal prosecution authorities, use federal courts to go after non-state actors effectively, certainly in that context, and I think we can draw some lessons from that.
So last question. We have Russia beginning an invasion of Ukraine. The United States, the UK, the EU, Japan, and others are initiating a range of sanctions in response. I think we all anticipate an escalation on both fronts as we go forward here. We've had a lot of debate and discussion in this country around what our response should be. how we should respond. I don't know that we've surfaced enough conversation around what we should anticipate in response from Russia to our, to the penalties we seek to impose for their aggression. So, how are you and the administration preparing for that, thinking through what the different levers are that Russia may be prepared to pull? What should we anticipate? What should the American people anticipate? What is National Security Division's role in preparing and responding to that?
Yeah, again, John, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate your remarks at the opening of our session today. I mean, certainly any conversation today about national security has to begin with, as you did, recognition of the crisis in Ukraine and I think an appreciation for how dangerous the situation is and the people in that part of the world who are in harm's way. For our part, the Justice Department, we're working along with the rest of the government to prepare for any possibility. I know that the president has raised a concern around the possibility of cyber attacks, and that's an area, obviously, of focus for us along with others. I think the United States government has made it clear that if Russia launches any sort of disruptive cyber attack against our companies or our critical infrastructures, that we're going to be prepared to respond. Again, for our part, we have a significant role to play within the Justice Department in terms of our ability to support a whole-of-government response, and that includes working with the FBI and with other federal partners to respond as we would need to. And this is, I can assure folks here today that this has been something that we are working around the clock on.
Jessica, over to you.
All right, is this live? Okay. Thanks everyone for their questions. Just following on what you just briefly spoke on, you spoke extensively about partnerships with the interagency and partner nations and allies, which is critical. Can you describe how you see that moving forward a bit more, as well as NSD's partnerships with private and civil society sector organizations?
Jessica, I'm very sorry. That's the very beginning of the question I didn't catch.
Yes, you spoke extensively about partnerships with interagencies and partner nations and allies. Can you explore that a little bit more, as well as with private civil society sector organizations?
Yeah, and this is such an important point. We often, people think about the Justice Department. I'm up here as a Justice Department official talking, but we are, integral to a broad national security community. Just a very concrete example is the participation of the Justice Department in the National Security Council decision-making process, which is basically happening, constantly, particularly in the context of the crisis in Ukraine, but on a range of issues, And so, and again, I think my experience in the counterterrorism context really showed me the power of those relationships. I used to say, if folks in the American public could see decision-making within the National Security Council and by the national security community, you'd be very proud to see how much expertise there is, how apolitical it is. And so those partnerships and the power that they can engender when people work together in that way, when departments and agencies bring to bear the range of authorities, it's just really impressive, and it's critical to our success. But it doesn't stop there. It extends to civil society, certainly extends to our allies around the world. And again, in the current crisis, you can be confident that those conversations are happening, not just in Washington, but around the world.
Thank you. Another question. Reports indicated that you had listening sessions with members of Congress before today. What are some of the things that you heard in those sessions?
Yeah, so, and as I mentioned, I started this review shortly after taking office in November of last year, and one of the most important features of that review for me was to understand both the nature of the threats that we face. That's, as I said, anything we're going to do has to be based on the threat. But it was also to understand the criticisms that were being made about the China initiative. And those criticisms came from a number of different quarters. They certainly came from members of Congress who I met with, But in particular, it came from the scientific and academic community, as well as from the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. And so I had the opportunity to meet with just many different groups and to hear about those concerns, which I talked about in my remarks. But just to be a bit concise, this concern that we had lower standards for people with ties to China in terms of our prosecutorial decision making, and that we were chilling from the scientific community, chilling our ability to attract the best and brightest to study or do research in the United States. What I will tell you is that in the course of my review, I never saw any indication, none, that any decision that the Justice Department made was based on bias or prejudice of any kind. This was a concern that I understand, and I appreciate that perception, but I didn't see that in any of the cases or any of the decisions that were made. Again, though, what's important to understand is that the mere perception of that type of bias undermines our efforts, and it makes it harder for us to earn the trust of the communities that we are trying to serve. So, I think that's probably the best way to answer that question.
Great, and this is somewhat tied to what you just stated. You've stated making clear academic integrity cases will be pursued if it meets intent, materiality, national security thresholds. What does this mean for pending cases? Is your investigation, is that the review, or is there going to be additional review?
So we've continued to pursue the cases that have been pending. We've reviewed those. Like we do every case, we consistently review. I am comfortable, although I'm not going to talk and can't talk about specifics in any of these cases, I am comfortable with those cases as they stand and their continued pursuit.
Wonderful. We've heard a lot about private sector and dealing with cyber threats. You've talked a little bit about how, whole of government approach. What can the private sector do? What can Silicon Valley do to assist DOJ and other agencies in protecting cutting edge technology?
Yeah, so that's another really, that's a huge topic. How can the government and the private sector work together to protect emerging technologies and critical technologies? I think, again, having worked both in a technology company and within the intelligence community and the Department of Justice, I do think that we have an opportunity to continue to work more closely together with technology companies to make sure they understand the nature of this threat, just information and education, so they understand the nature of this threat. We have to continue to build trust between these two communities. That trust has been harmed over the past decade, and I think that trust is critical so that we are willing to share information with each other, find each other credible when we bring information to each other. I do think that for the Justice Department's side, we can, cases that we might bring, investigations we might bring, we need to be able to work with these technology companies to understand where they face threats and where we can be supportive. And I think that's, the perfect example is in the cyber realm, understanding when companies face cyber threats. Some of it's helping them understand the nature of the threat so that they can better protect themselves and defend their networks and their data. And in other cases, it's just being in a position to hold nefarious actors accountable. But again, I've worked on both sides of this issue, and I really feel that the opportunity to be more collaborative is in front of us, and it depends on building trust.
Great, and then we got a lot along the lines of, we've talking about a new approach for DOJ. Is this the official end to the China initiative?
Yeah, to be clear, we are no longer going to have a China initiative. That means there won't be a website, although it will still be available in the archives, but we are not having a China initiative going forward. Again, having listened to the concerns, and most importantly, also having understood the nature of the threat we face today, I think a better strategy, a more appropriate, more effective strategy is to look at all of the threats we face from nation-state actors and to build our strategy and to send the demand signal to our partners, to the U.S. Attorney's offices, to the FBI, to focus on all of these threats from hostile nation-states across the board, and to learn and to focus on how we can use the tools and authorities that we have at the Justice Department to combat these threats.
Great. One last one. Can you talk a little bit more about the evolution of DOJ's approach to naming and shaming of foreign government-affiliated or sponsored cyber actors, and what you're seeing, if anything, in terms of reciprocation or retaliation?
So we bring cases when we find violations of the criminal law that we can prove. In some cases, we ultimately charge defendants. We hope that we will be able to bring them to the United States and into an open court in our country and prosecute those and bring our charges forward in that context. Where we don't, where the indictment speaks for itself and we speak through our charging documents, that can have an impact as well. So I think we need to continue to, again, do what we do best at the Justice Department, and that is to follow the facts, apply the law, and bring evidence to bear where we have violations of the criminal law. And in some cases, that means we'll have people in courtrooms in the United States. In other cases, that may be not happening in the near term, but we have long memories at the Justice Department and the FBI, and we'll continue to pursue the people we charge to bring them to justice.
I hope you'll forgive me some quick marketing. So thanks to everyone for joining us. Please be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter at Mason NatSec. Please check out our podcasts, Fault Lines and Iron Butterfly. And please tune into some upcoming events we have. The first with Anya Manuel, moderated by Nick Schifrin on March 22nd, that explores China's push to become the next technology leader. And then our next NatSec Nightcap event with Secretary Mike Pompeo on May 26th. Thank you for joining us, for being here.
Thank you.
Have a great evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much.